Hello, everyone. My name is Jan Dormer, and today we're going to talk about research on missionary language learning and what TESOL has to offer. Uh, I teach TESOL at Messiah University in Pennsylvania, and a little bit about my background is that I am an American, but I grew up in Brazil, actually, and there's a photo from many, many years ago of myself and my family. Um, and then I married a Canadian, and then my husband and I served in Indonesia and also went back to Brazil, and then later in Kenya as well. And so I bring multiple perspectives to this topic of missionary language learning, and that of an MK, a missionary kid, of missionary parents of MKs. We raised our own daughters on the mission field, a dorm mom. My husband and I were dorm parents of 16 teenage boys when we served in Indonesia. A teacher of MKs at multiple international schools, and a language teacher for many, many years. I've been in TESOL, and more recently, I trained teachers and have been doing some research as well. So those are the different perspectives that I bring to this topic of missionary language learning and how that fits with my field of TESOL. Um, what led to my interest in missionary language acquisition? Of course, you can see with all the missions in my background that, it was a good fit maybe, but there were also some things that piqued my interest on this topic. I observed some mission perspectives and practices that kind of surprised me. One is that the student takes full responsibility for their language learning. This is a perspective that I see in missions sometimes. The burden of language learning is solely on the shoulders of the student, with an accompanying thought of no expectation really that the teacher or school or program bears some responsibility for the student's success in second language acquisition. Um, Virtually no understanding of what constitutes appropriate training for a language teacher. So this is an issue I've seen in some mission circles, little understanding of what a language teacher is and how they're trained. A strong emphasis on language coaching, even though most language coaches, or the ones that I have become acquainted with, are not language teachers or trained in second language acquisition necessarily. I'm sure some of them are, but in my experience, many are not. Finally, missionary language learning preparation programs that are taught or led by individuals with no training in language teaching or learning, or in second language acquisition. It's very experience driven with minimal value placed on formal education or training in the field. And these perspectives over the years in my service in missions, these perspectives have kind of been at odds with my TESOL education and experience, because after all, I, as an English teacher, feel responsibility for my students' learning. I feel that if my students don't learn, that is at least partially my fault. And so some of the perspectives that I've seen in missionary language acquisition circles have been at odds with some of the TESOL perspectives I've held. And that led to the interest in this topic. And I hope it will pique your interest as well as a TESOL professional listening to this. So I did some research, and actually my research was kind of to foreground a book that I hoped to write and that has now been written, Language Learning and Ministry, Preparing for Cross-Cultural Language Acquisition. The book just came out in January. But my research was not necessarily because I wanted to report research, but I just wanted a background to see if what I was seeing was out there and being seen by other people. So I had a total of 140 questionnaires sent to 140 missionary participants. I didn't put any restrictions on time of language study, like the year in which they studied language, or their age. They all had to be adults and they all had to have experienced language learning as identified as a missionary or cross-cultural Christian worker. I elicited learner perceptions on their preparation, their support, the effectiveness of their learning, and on affective factors, their emotional experience. Then I had a grad student actually helping me with this, and we did additional interviews with about 15 participants. Some topics that emerged through the research were a lot of misconceptions about second language acquisition. To all of us, probably in this field, that is not surprising. We have probably all encountered lots of misconceptions about second language acquisition. Um, and so that definitely did show up in the research. Lots of discussion on pre-field preparation, on on-field professional guidance and supervision when they were already on the field of service and trying to learn the language. There was quite a bit that emerged about agency, like mission agency policies and standards where language acquisition was concerned. And one that I didn't quite expect was how prominent issues of family were, consideration of family needs. And so those are the 5 topics I'm going to address in this talk and share some of the research with you. So first, to talk about misconceptions, I divide this into 2 parts: misconceptions held by the learners themselves, those who were trying to learn a language, and then misconceptions held by teachers. I did not interview the teachers. In that category, I am reporting what learners said that their teachers believed. So it's secondhand there. But so first, misconceptions held by learners. And this first one is not surprising either. Young children learn language more easily than adults. Many comments on that topic. Here were a few quotes from the questionnaires. Learning a language over 40 for someone like me was not a good thing. I do believe children are much better learners because even their mouths haven't formed completely and they are just so less resistant to the challenges language learning presents. So these were typical. There were many responses like this. And so, on this topic, and as I kind of get to each topic, I'm going to share what I think would be helpful for missionaries to understand. Older learners have some advantages, and adults can acquire new languages through most of the adult years. And childhood language learning is not without stress. Some more misconceptions held by learners. High school language experiences are an accurate indicator of language learning potential. So here's a quote: not enjoying language or grammar in high school didn't help. Not understanding grammar was a true weak point. What would be helpful for missionaries to understand? That many high school foreign language classes do not really promote second language acquisition very well. Number 3, some people have language aptitude and others don't. Here's a quote: my husband had a much harder time learning because he has low aptitude, but he worked hard and got to a decent level. And another one: some people are much more gifted at languages than others. These might not be wrong, but to a certain degree, they're a little bit erroneous. And what I think would be helpful for missionaries to understand is that second language acquisition is complex and multifaceted. Aptitude tests capture only a very small set of skills, and they ignore many others, which can contribute to effective communication in the target language. And finally, another misconception often held by the learners, immersion is essential. And just some of these quotes kind of show what they mean by immersion. Immersion is critical. We found the single missionary who lived in a national home picked it up much quicker. Okay, but most people can't do that. Anything you do works well as long as you are immersed in the language and do not have good access to your native language. So what I think would be helpful as a counterpoint to that is more is not always better. There is a saturation point beyond which more target language input is probably not helpful and could even be damaging. The first language is actually a needed tool, or at least a useful one for most adult learners in the second language. So these are different perspectives that could be helpful. Um, Misconceptions held by the teachers. So here's one that I imagine everyone has seen before. The first language can't be helpful in learning the second language. And here's a telling quote of one person's experience. School had the policy you should stay in the target language the whole time. I've taught ESL and I understand this approach, but at some point you see the anxiety level rising, so you give the word in the first language. One rule of the school was that only the target language should be spoken in the classroom. We had one teacher who respected this rule excessively. She wouldn't give us the English word, even if she knew it, until she had spent 15 minutes trying to get us to understand the second language word by using circumlocutions that we also didn't understand. And so, what would be a more helpful understanding? The first language can be, or often is, a very useful tool in acquiring the second, especially for adults. Banning the first language from language classes really has no support in modern language instruction, outright bans on the first language. And another one, oral language must be learned before written. And here are a couple of quotes. In the beginning, the pattern was to not let us see words. We just had to listen to jabber to me. This was supposed to acquaint me to the language, but only served to frustrate me. I was sure I would never learn the language. I'm not an auditory learner. I need to see the words and study them. I would put post-its all over the house to help myself learn. In the end, I could pass my tests. I got out with people and was afraid to talk and mess up. And the second quote, I know there are different learning styles, and I'm a very visual learner. So when a Spanish teacher in another country insisted that I begin only by listening without being given formal written instruction with examples of right and wrong, I was very frustrated. I couldn't fix the rules in my head until I finally convinced her to give me a written sheet with the rules she was trying to explain. So these show kind of very dogmatic approaches, very prescriptive. And what might be helpful is adult learners are usually best served being able to use all the tools at their disposal. And a significant one for many adults is the written word. Oral activities where text is not used can be good, but a ban on any kind of text is probably not helpful for many learners in many circumstances. And so, after the misconceptions, we'll talk about these other topics. Pre-field preparation. So, what did the participants say about that? Many participants wish they had learned more about second language acquisition before going to the field of service. Here are a couple of quotes. I wish I would have understood more about language learning from the beginning and had been presented with options earlier on. I did not do a pre-field course. I could have used my time so much better if I would have had that course. If I could have looked at skills and competencies used, how I'm covering all the areas, how did I do that? So just more understanding. And the second point there, many participants wish they had learned more about the emotional factors involved in second language acquisition. 30% of respondents checked, I wish I had learned about the emotional factors in language learning. And here is a telling but very sad quote. Our entire group hated it, the language learning experience. And one student even tried to commit suicide. I hope that's rare, but a lot of angst and frustration, anxiety, stress did show up in many of the comments. So, what did they feel about on field professional guidance and supervision? Um, this is interesting that all participants indicated a lack of second language acquisition experts in their organizations. So, maybe they did or did not know if those people were there, but that's what they all said. 0%, like none of them, said that there was a language expert at their headquarters supervising all language acquisition on all fields. And 70% said they did not know of any second language acquisition professional having any involvement in their language learning process, even on the field, even wherever they were studying, the language. Um, so, so people's perceptions, at least, was that there was very little expertise involved in the decisions about their language learning. Many participants wanted more guidance in selection of second language acquisition options. 40% of respondents chose the option, I wish there had been more discussion between me and my superior in terms of selecting the language learning options appropriate for me. And 50% of respondents chose the option, I wish that procedures, systems, resources had been in place for me to learn the language. A few more that relate to that. There was very little structure in how my organization supervised our progress in language learning. We felt like we were literally on our own, and it was tough. I wish there had been more discussion about the differences and relative strengths and weaknesses of language school versus tutors. I wish I had learned how to use informal language tutors better. Many participants identified things they wished had been different during their initial months or years on the field with regard to learning a language. So these are some interesting statistics here. 50% wanted more procedures, systems, resources in place to learn the language. 40% wanted more discussion between the learner and their superior about selection of appropriate language learning options. 30% said, give me a teacher that's trained in foreign language teaching. There were some very strong comments about language teachers not being trained to teach language. 25% wanted an environment to learn in class instead of having to memorize everything at home. They were going to classes, but they found they had to do the real learning at home. 19% experience success in class, so they don't get discouraged. Only about 19% talked about being successful in the classroom. 15% wanted a language class instead of a tutor. 6% wanted a tutor instead of a class. Many participants indicated frustration in having teachers who were not trained in second language acquisition. Here are some of the quotes on that topic from the interviews. Offer me someone who can teach. A participant spoke about tutors who were helpful, but the language learners had to direct and guide the tutors in their own learning. Unexpectedly, was not prepared to do that. Other respondents commented on their frustration in not receiving more direction from teachers about what they could do to continue in their learning. Respondents who had more than one language teacher did recognize the difference in their teachers between a skilled and trained teacher and less skilled teachers. Participants reported many examples of language teaching that did not follow second language acquisition best practices. That's a whole other talk, but I did create a whole list of practices that respondents talked about having been used, and then, are they now considered best practice in language teaching or not? And many are not. So the next category is agency policies and standards. So what is the mission agency? What are their policies and standards? So participants questioned high stakes testing and the place of language in missionary evaluation. And I think I'll only read one of these quotes to save some time here. I reached an intermediate level and was able to pass the language test and proceed to my ministry. I was able to carry on basic conversations, greetings, shopping in the markets, etc. I was required to take another language test at the end of my first term and took several weeks of intense remedial tutoring. I did pass the test, but found it very stressful. If we didn't pass the test, we would have to go back into full-time language learning when returning from our home assignment. So those kinds of stress factors around the testing of languages were prominent, and some people questioned the accuracy of some of those tests in relation to actual communicative ability. Participants also questioned no ministry during language study. This is a policy that some mission agencies have. We were told absolutely no ministry until the language was mastered. Now, side note here, that's a little problematic when you think of taking 5 or 6 years to master a language. Language is important, but it is interesting. I've known missionaries uh, whose language of their host country could be rather embarrassing because it is not good, yet they've had very effective ministries. That does not mean we should not all strive to be the best in the language we can be, but it does show that God can work despite our weaknesses. And I won't read the second quote there, but this became a prominent theme in the book I wrote because I feel somewhat passionate about that. How some actual communicative skills are kind of ignored in the process. And there were a few comments on the other side that this first one here, I'll just summarize, where someone is saying, I wish I could have focused only on learning the language and not be pushed into ministry. There is certainly that perspective as well. And this shows the need for individualized approaches to decisions about ministry and language study. Now, a surprising thing that emerged, surprising to me, was how often family considerations were mentioned. Many participants desired more family-friendly second language acquisition options. Among those suggested or implied were an understanding that parents with children at home may not have time for homework, provision of childcare, whole family language learning options, which honestly, I don't know why that's not more of a thing. It could work so well. Studying in the country of service so the family doesn't have to move twice. And many participants lamented the fact that their children did not learn the local language well, and that MK learning of the local language did not seem to be valued by their agencies. And in case you're wondering about the two photos on that slide, yes, that's me. The top photo is my brothers and me when we were dressed up as we were MKs in Brazil, and we were dressed up as no Brazilian ever, dresses like that to go sing. But that's what was done back in the 70s. And so that's illustrative of my own MK years. And then below that is my husband Rod and I with our two daughters, and when we were serving in Brazil. And so in the book, I contrast, I have a whole chapter devoted to the language needs of missionary kids. And I think it's a really important topic. And I contrast my own immersion in a Brazilian school with how we approached it with our own daughters when we were in Brazil. It's interesting that we were about the same ages when we went to Brazil, and yet I had a kind of devastating experience. Uh, at first, being immersed in a Brazilian school, and my daughter's experience was much more successful because I was able to kind of engineer the the situation. And so I talk about those two experiences in the book, and I talk a lot about the needs of missionary children and the needs of the whole family. We can't forget that missionaries who go overseas to serve, many, if not, most, I would say, probably go as families, and the impact on the family is really important to consider. Um, I've kind of run through all of that fairly quickly. And in order to have time for discussion, I'll just throw out the discussion questions now, and then maybe say a few concluding remarks, and then we'll go to the discussion. So, do any of these issues resonate with you in your own experiences or work with missionaries and mission agencies? And circling back to the what I put in the title of the connection with TESOL, how can TESOL professionals get involved and help to improve missionary language acquisition? I really think that all of us here in this kind of conference, we we could bring a lot to many mission agencies, and I know of some individuals in this group who are actively doing that, and I think that's wonderful. And maybe some of you serve within an agency, but maybe you've never considered kind of approaching the leadership of your agency and asking what is being done with regard to missionary language acquisition, and how can I help? And so if that is your situation and you haven't thought of getting involved in that aspect of your agency, I would encourage you to do so, because I do think there is a lot that we can offer and bring to the learning of languages. So I will see you in the discussion.